Imagine a conflict so intense and deadly that it could have escalated into a third world war, yet today it remains almost completely forgotten. This is the story of the Ogaden War, a fierce struggle that occurred from 1977 to 1978 in the Horn of Africa. It's a tale of espionage, Cold War tension, and a clash that drew in superpowers, yet it has slipped through the cracks of our collective historical memory. Our story begins in the arid deserts of the Ogaden, a sparse and unforgiving region in the east of Ethiopia. This area, rich in culture and history, became the unlikely arena for a conflict that involved not just Ethiopia and Somalia, but also the United States, the Soviet Union, and a host of other nations drawn into the fray by alliances and Cold War rivalries. The roots of the Ogaden War stretch back to the era of European colonialism, when borders drawn with little regard for ethnic or cultural realities left the Somali people divided across several countries, including Ethiopia. By the 1970s, the call for a greater Somalia was irresistible, inflaming tensions in the region. However, what transformed these tensions into a full-blown war was the involvement of the Cold War superpowers. Ethiopia, historically a US ally, underwent a profound change in 1974 when Emperor Haile Selassie was overthrown in a coup. The military junta that took power, known as the Derg, initially sought support from the US, but when their requests for aid were rebuffed, they turned to the Soviet Union, flipping Ethiopia from a staunch anti-communist bastion into a Soviet ally almost overnight. Meanwhile, Somalia, under the rule of President Siad Barre, was also a beneficiary of Soviet military aid, hoping to use this support to annex the Ogaden region. The stage was set for a conflict that would draw in neighboring countries and superpowers alike, each vying for influence in this strategic corner of Africa. As tensions escalated, Somali guerrillas began making incursions into the Ogaden in 1977, claiming to liberate their ethnic kin from Ethiopian rule. By mid-1977, these skirmishes had intensified, and in July, Somali forces launched a full-scale invasion. The Somalis quickly overran much of the Ogaden, capitalizing on the chaos in Ethiopia and the initial lack of response from the Soviet Union, now the patron of both warring nations. The response of the international community was muted. The world was distracted by other crises, and few outside the immediate region understood the complexities or the stakes of the conflict. But behind closed doors, in the halls of power in Moscow and Washington, the Ogaden War was seen as a critical test of strength and influence. By October 1977, the situation reached a turning point. Somalia controlled most of the Ogaden and seemed poised for victory, but the Soviet Union made a decisive shift that would alter the course of the conflict dramatically. Faced with the prospect of a pro-Soviet Ethiopia collapsing and the implications that would have for their global strategy, the Soviets began to withdraw their support from Somalia, reallocating it to Ethiopia. This included not only vast shipments of modern military equipment, but also the deployment of Cuban combat troops and advisors. The Ogaden War was no longer a regional conflict. It had become another proxy battlefield in the global Cold War. As Cuban and Soviet support began to bolster Ethiopian forces, the tides of war shifted. Despite their initial successes, the Somali forces found themselves increasingly outmatched and outgunned. By late 1977, Ethiopia began to reclaim lost territory, pushing back against the Somali invaders with newfound strength. But just as Ethiopia seemed to be gaining the upper hand, a new development threatened to change everything once again. In the shadows, another player was making its move, one that could potentially escalate the conflict to an even broader and more devastating scale. As we stand on the brink of this transformation, the question remains, how did this conflict manage to draw the eyes of the world's superpowers, yet today remains largely forgotten? What were the consequences of this brutal war for the Horn of Africa and for the world? And what can it teach us about the dangers of global powers playing a geopolitical chess game in far-flung regions? Stay with us as we delve deeper into the main battle of the Ogaden War, uncover the maneuvers of global superpowers, and reveal the untold stories of a war that shaped and then was lost by the sands of time. As the Ogaden War escalated, the harsh terrain of the region itself became as much a participant in the conflict as the soldiers. The Ogaden Desert, with its relentless heat and sparse resources, proved a formidable challenge to both Ethiopian and Somali forces. Logistics became a nightmare. Supply lines were stretched to breaking points, and both sides faced severe shortages of water and food. The environment itself extracted a heavy toll on the troops, with many soldiers succumbing to dehydration and exhaustion. The Soviet Union's pivot away from Somalia to fully back Ethiopia marked a dramatic shift in the dynamics of the war. This move was not just a shift in military aid, it represented a significant strategic realignment in the Cold War's global chessboard. With new Soviet support, Ethiopia began to organize a counteroffensive that would be marked by both its scale and its brutality. The main battles of the Ogaden War unfolded with a ferocity that belied the region's previous obscurity. One of the most significant confrontations occurred at Jiga in early 1978. The battle for this strategic town exemplified the new Ethiopian strategy under Soviet advisement, a combination of conventional warfare tactics bolstered by significant artillery and air support. Cuban combat troops, experienced from other proxy conflicts in Angola and Latin America, brought a level of military expertise that the Somali forces could not match. As Ethiopian and Cuban forces recaptured Jika in March 1978, the scenes were apocalyptic. The town, which had been under Somali control, was subjected to intense bombardment, leading to high civilian casualties and massive destruction. The battle set the tone for subsequent engagements, where the Ethiopians, now better equipped and advised, took a more aggressive stance. Simultaneously, the tactics employed by both sides often bordered on the reckless. The Somali forces, despite their diminishing Soviet support, continued to wage large-scale offensives. Their strategy was based on high mobility and the element of surprise, utilizing light infantry who could move quickly through the arid landscapes. However, as the war dragged on, these tactics became less effective against the increasingly well-coordinated and heavily armed Ethiopian forces. One catastrophic mistake by the Somali military was the underestimation of Ethiopia's resolve and its newfound international support. When the war began, Somali leaders believed that a quick victory was possible, primarily due to the turmoil within Ethiopia and the initial hesitancy of the Soviet response. However, the consolidation of power by the Derg regime in Ethiopia and the shift in Soviet priorities meant that Somalia found itself increasingly isolated. On the Ethiopian side, the reliance on foreign troops and advisors was a double-edged sword. While it provided them with the necessary military strength to turn the tide, it also led to tensions with local populations. Reports of atrocities committed by foreign troops exacerbated ethnic tensions within the region, leading to long-term consequences for Ethiopian domestic stability. The environmental and human costs escalated as the war continued. Both sides were accused of targeting civilian populations and using food as a weapon of war, particularly in the contested areas where control flipped frequently between the combatants. The displacement of thousands of civilians resulted in a humanitarian crisis that went largely unnoticed by the outside world, amidst the larger geopolitical gamesmanship. By the late stages of the war, the Somali forces were in retreat, but the conflict was far from over. Ethiopia, emboldened by its successes, pursued the Somali forces across the border, leading to further skirmishes and destabilizing the region even further. The war officially ended in March 1978, but its aftermath lingered for decades with ongoing guerrilla warfare and border conflicts. The Ogaden War, despite its intensity and the involvement of global superpowers, faded from international consciousness rapidly after its conclusion. The end of the Cold War and shifts in global politics shifted the focus away from the Horn of Africa. Moreover, the complexity of the conflict, with its blend of local grievances and global strategies, made it a difficult narrative to maintain in the public eye. In retrospect, the Ogaden War serves as a stark reminder of how regional conflicts can be amplified by the involvement of global powers, leading to devastating consequences for the local population. It also highlights the dangers of proxy warfare, where the interests of the local actors are often overshadowed by the agendas of more powerful states. As such, while the war itself may have been forgotten, the lessons it offers remain critically relevant in today's increasingly interconnected and politically complex world. The climactic end of the Ogaden War came with swift and brutal force. As 1978 dawned, the balance of power had tipped decisively in favor of Ethiopia, bolstered by significant Soviet and Cuban support. The recapture of key towns like Jijika had given the Ethiopian forces a strategic advantage, and they pushed this momentum further, launching a series of offensives that would eventually force the Somali troops into a full retreat. Somalia's President Siad Barre, realizing the untenability of his position, called for a unilateral withdrawal of his forces in March 1978, but the retreat was disorderly and marked by chaos. As Somali forces pulled back, they left behind a devastated landscape and a population reeling from the horrors of war. Ethiopian troops now in pursuit crossed into Somali territory, exacerbating tensions and extending the conflict beyond its previous borders. The human cost of the Ogaden War was staggering. Estimates suggest that tens of thousands of soldiers died, while civilian casualties were even higher, compounded by the displacement of hundreds of thousands of people. Villages were destroyed and entire communities were uprooted, their way of life shattered irreversibly. Famine followed the conflict, worsened by the destruction and disruption of normal agricultural activities. International aid was slow to arrive and insufficient to meet the vast needs, leaving many to suffer from starvation and disease. The aftermath of the war was also marked by widespread human rights abuses. Reports of massacres, rapes, and the indiscriminate shelling of civilians emerged, with both sides accused of atrocities. The presence of foreign troops, particularly Cuban forces in Ethiopia, added layers of complexity and resentment among the local populations, who often viewed them as occupiers rather than liberators. Despite its severity and the involvement of major global powers, the Ogaden War quickly receded from international focus. Several factors contributed to its descent into obscurity. First, the end of the conflict coincided with dramatic shifts in global politics, including the Iranian Revolution and the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, which redirected the world's attention. Additionally, the complexities of the war, rooted in intricate local and ethnic disputes, made it difficult for international observers to fully grasp and maintain interest in the conflict. Moreover, the Cold War context in which the Ogaden War occurred meant that once it ceased to be a proxy battleground, superpowers like the Soviet Union and the United States had little incentive to highlight or remember the conflict. Their focus shifted to other regions and other crises, leaving the Horn of Africa to grapple with the war's lingering impacts alone. In Ethiopia, the war solidified the military regime's control, but it also planted the seeds for future conflicts. The Derg regime's reliance on Soviet support and the brutal methods employed during the war left a legacy of violence and mistrust. In Somalia, the defeat severely undermined Barre's regime, setting the stage for future uprisings and contributing to the eventual collapse of the Somali state in the early 1990s. The Ogaden War also had significant repercussions for regional politics in the Horn of Africa, exacerbating tensions between Somalia and Ethiopia and among various ethnic groups within each country. These tensions persisted, fueling ongoing conflicts and instability in the region. As the decades have passed, the Ogaden War has faded from collective memory, overshadowed by other conflicts and crises. Yet, its lessons remain critically relevant, particularly the dangers of external involvement in local disputes and the long-term consequences of such interventions. Today, the Ogaden region remains a place of strategic importance and potential instability. While Ethiopia and Somalia have made some diplomatic progress, the underlying issues that fueled the war, ethnic divisions, territorial disputes, and the legacies of colonialism remain unresolved. The Ogaden War serves as a somber reminder of the destructive power of military conflict and the enduring impact of geopolitical strategies on innocent lives. It teaches us about the perils of ignoring the complexities of local contexts and the human cost of pursuing power at any cost. As we reflect on this forgotten war, it challenges us to remember that in the annals of history no conflict is truly distant or irrelevant. Each carries lessons that can illuminate the paths toward peace or perdition. In a world still rife with conflict and intervention, the story of the Ogaden War underscores the need for a deeper understanding and a more humane approach to international relations. As we look back, let us not forget the lives lost and the communities destroyed, but let us also strive to learn from the past to shape a more just and peaceful future.